Never pick up abandoned toys by the roadside. Some objects carry more than memories. They carry hunger, a desperate need that's been festering for decades, waiting for someone foolish enough or kind enough to bring them home. The roadside is littered with forgotten things, but some of them were left there for a reason. Some of them have been waiting. And Marcus Webb was about to learn this lesson the hardest way possible. Marcus Webb was 38 years old, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd made it home for dinner. The highway stretched endlessly before him, swallowed by Mississippi darkness. His headlights carved weak tunnels through the night, illuminating nothing but cracked asphalt and the skeletal remains of cotton fields on either side. It was 9:15 p.m. on a Thursday, and he was 2 hours late. Again, his phone sat face down on the passenger seat. Lizzie's missed calls glowing accusingly through the leather case. He'd stopped checking after the fifth one. Corporate, consulting paid well, but it devoured everything else. Today had been another marathon back-to-back client meetings in Jackson, each one bleeding into the next until the sun set and he realized he'd promised Emma he'd be home to help with her science project. 7 years old, and she was already learning that Daddy's promises were made of smoke. The guilt sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. He took the rural route home, avoiding the interstate. It was longer, but quieter. Out here, there was nothing but darkness and the occasional farmhouse light flickering in the distance like a dying star. The kind of road where you could drive for 30 minutes without seeing another car. The kind of road where things got forgotten. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a shape in his peripheral vision, something pale against the fence post, catching his headlights. Marcus's foot eased off the gas instinctively. As his truck slowed, the shape resolved into something that made his breath catch. A teddy bear. It sat propped against a weathered fence post, positioned perfectly upright, as if someone had just placed it there moments ago. The bear was old, he could tell, even from the road. Faded brown fur, one ear slightly torn, button eyes that caught his headlights and reflected them back like tiny mirrors. Behind it, barely visible in the darkness, stood a small white cross, a roadside memorial, choked with weeds and forgotten by time. Marcus pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath his tires. He told himself he was just curious, that he'd take a quick look and keep driving. But even as he put the truck in park, he knew that wasn't true. The bear was perfect, vintage, probably from the 60s or 70s. Emma collected stuffed animals. Her bed was practically buried in them. This one would make her smile. Maybe it would soften the disappointment in her eyes when he walked through the door 2 hours late with nothing but excuses. Marcus killed the engine and stepped out into the night. The silence hit him first. Not the peaceful quiet of a country evening, but something else, something suffocating. No crickets, no wind rustling through the cotton fields, just a thick, oppressive stillness that made his ears ring. The air smelled wrong too, not like Mississippi summer, but like something old and stale, like a room that hadn't been opened in decades. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the truck. The bear sat too perfectly, like it had been placed, not dropped. No child would position a toy that carefully. No grieving parent would leave something so pristine at a forgotten memorial. The cross behind it was barely standing, its white paint peeling away in strips, the name weathered into illegibility. But the bear looked almost new, despite its obvious age. Marcus approached slowly, his shoes crunching on gravel that sounded too loud in the unnatural quiet. The memorial was ancient, the flowers long since rotted away, the ground around it overgrown with weeds that clawed at his ankles. How long had this cross been here? 20 years? 30? Longer? And yet the bear looked like it had been placed yesterday. The cold didn't just creep up his spine, it slammed into him like a physical force. A sudden, vicious chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Marcus froze 3 feet from the bear, his hand outstretched, every nerve in his body firing warnings. The button eyes seemed to track his movement, following him with an awareness that glass shouldn't possess. Leave it. Get back in the truck. Drive away. But the guilt was crushing. The weight of another broken promise, another disappointed face, another evening where Emma would go to bed wondering why Daddy never had time for her. This bear could fix that. This one small gesture could show her that he was thinking about her, that he cared, that he was trying. Marcus would replay this moment 1,000 times. wondering if he'd felt the bear's cold pulse when he picked it up, or if terror had rewritten his memory. His fingers closed around the worn fur. It was ice cold, far colder than it should have been sitting in the summer heat. For just a fraction of a second, he could have sworn he felt something beneath the fabric, a rhythm, a heartbeat, a whisper of something that had been waiting. Then it was gone, and he was holding nothing but an old stuffed toy. Marcus walked back to his truck. The bear clutched against his chest. He didn't look back at the memorial, didn't see the way the shadows seemed to follow him, or notice how the temperature inside his cab dropped 10 degrees the moment he set the bear on the passenger seat. He was too busy rehearsing what he'd say to Emma, imagining the smile on her face. He thought he was finally doing something right. What Marcus couldn't have known was that some gifts come with a price written in grief and desperation. The engine started with a rumble that shattered the suffocating silence. Marcus pulled back onto the empty road, his headlights cutting through the darkness. In the passenger seat, the bear sat perfectly upright, button eyes staring straight ahead, waiting, patient, because what Marcus didn't know was that the bear had been waiting by that road for 63 years, and it wasn't waiting alone. Marcus pulled into the driveway at 9:47 p.m., the porch light blazing like an accusation. The bear sat in the passenger seat beside him, those button eyes still staring straight ahead. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, his hand on the door handle. The drive home had been strange, the cab of his truck never quite warming up despite the Mississippi heat, a persistent chill that clung to his skin. He'd turned the heat on full blast, but it hadn't helped, and twice, he could have sworn he'd seen the bear shift position in his peripheral vision. But when he looked directly at it, the bear was always perfectly still. Marcus shook off the unease and grabbed the toy. It was just an old stuffed animal, nothing more. He was exhausted, his mind playing tricks after a 14-hour workday. Emma would love it. That's all that mattered. The front door opened before he could reach it. Lizzie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression a carefully controlled mask of frustration. She'd been crying, he could see the redness around her eyes, quickly wiped away before he got close enough to comment. 8 years of marriage had taught him to recognize that particular brand of exhausted disappointment. Lizzie told him quietly that Emma had waited backpack ready. Project spread across the table until 8:30, when she'd finally sent her to bed. Her tone was flat, emptied of anger. Marcus began to apologize, but she cut him off, reminding him his meetings always ran late. Stepping aside, her gaze fell to the bear in his hands. Confusion flickered. She asked what it was. Marcus forced a smile, calling it a peace offering he'd found on the way home. But the bear looked wrong, old, unearthed. Lizzie's unease deepened, and before she could speak, Emma's small voice called from upstairs. He greeted her, apologized for being late, and held up the bear he'd found. Emma's reaction wasn't just enthusiastic, it was unnaturally intense. Her eyes lit up with recognition, widening so far Marcus could see the whites all around. She flew down the stairs so fast, Lizzie gasped and reached out to catch her, terrified she'd fall. But Emma moved with absolute certainty, her small feet barely touching the steps. She crashed into Marcus's legs and seized the bear from his hands with a desperation that felt wrong. She whispered a name, Lily, clutching the toy against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. She said it without hesitation, without thought, as if the name had always been there, waiting. Marcus and Lizzie exchanged glances. Emma hadn't even looked at the bear for more than a second. Lizzie knelt beside her daughter and asked carefully how she knew the bear's name. Emma didn't answer. She was staring at the bear with an intensity that made Lizzie's stomach turn. Her small fingers stroked the worn fur with a familiarity that shouldn't exist. She clutched the bear like she'd known it her entire life, like it was an old friend returned from a long journey. Marcus tried again, asking where she'd heard that name. Emma said simply that the bear had told her, that Lily had told her, that she'd been waiting such a long time. She said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The temperature in the room plummeted 20 degrees in minutes. Lizzie felt at first a sudden, vicious cold that raised goosebumps across her arms and made her breath visible. She looked at Marcus, saw the confusion on his face shift to alarm as he felt it too. The thermostat on the wall read 72 degrees, but the air felt like winter. Lizzie asked again, her voice tight, where Emma had really gotten that bear. Emma looked up, confused. and reminded them that Daddy had given it to her. Then she asked if she could take Lily to bed, and her smile was radiant, genuine, the happiest Lizzie had seen her in weeks. Marcus wanted to say no, wanted to take the bear back, drive it to the roadside, and leave it where he'd found it. But Emma was smiling at him, really smiling, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd put that expression on her face. He heard himself agree, but added that she needed to take a bath first. Emma asked if Lily could come to the bath. Marcus started to protest that the bear would get wet, but Emma's eyes filled with tears so quickly it startled them both. She begged him not to take the bear away. She said that everyone takes her away, and the desperation in her voice was wrong. Too deep, too old. The plea came from somewhere beyond a 7-year-old's understanding. Lizzie's concern was dismissed with a wave from Marcus, who was already caving. He told Emma to be careful with the toy. Emma's tears vanished instantly, replaced by that too bright smile. She ran upstairs. The bear clutched so tightly against her chest that her knuckles were white. Marcus and Lizzie stood in the foyer, the temperature slowly creeping back to normal. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They both felt it. Something fundamental had shifted the moment Emma touched that bear. That night, after Emma's bath, after she'd been tucked into bed with the bear positioned carefully beside her on the pillow, Marcus and Lizzie lay awake in their own room. The house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the hallway clock, the soft whisper of the air conditioning. But Emma's room was different. The air in Emma's room didn't just smell stale, it reeked of decay and mothballs, like a closet that hadn't been opened since 1962. Marcus had noticed it when he'd kissed Emma goodnight, a smell that didn't belong. Old, forgotten, like something that had been buried. At 11:47 p.m., Lizzie grabbed Marcus's arm in the darkness and whispered if he could hear something. Marcus held his breath. At first, there was nothing. Then, drifting through the walls like smoke, came a sound that stopped their hearts. Singing. A child's voice, soft and sweet, singing a lullaby neither of them recognized. The melody was old-fashioned, something from another era, with words about waiting by the road and Mama coming back soon. It was Emma's voice, but it wasn't. Marcus threw off the covers and ran to Emma's room, Lizzie right behind him. He pushed open the door, and the cold hit them like a wall. Emma lay in bed, eyes closed, lips moving. The lullaby poured from her sleeping mouth in a voice that was hers but older, sadder, soaked in loneliness that no 7-year-old should understand. The bear sat upright on her pillow, button eyes gleaming in the darkness. And Marcus understood, with a horror that sank into his bones, that this was just the beginning of his nightmare. Because at midnight, Emma began to sing a lullaby that hadn't been heard in over 6 decades. Marcus woke at 12:03 a.m. to the sound of his daughter singing. For a moment, suspended in that fog between sleep and consciousness, he thought it was sweet. Emma had always loved to sing little made-up songs about her stuffed animals, Disney melodies she'd learned at school. But as his mind cleared and the fog lifted, Marcus realized this was different. The voice was Emma's, but it wasn't. It carried the same pitch, the same cadence, but underneath lay something older. Something soaked in a sadness that no 7-year-old should be able to express. The melody drifted through the walls like cold smoke, old-fashioned and haunting, each note trembling with decades of loneliness. Lizzie was already awake beside him, her hand clutching his arm so tightly it hurt. She didn't speak, didn't need to. They both lay there in the darkness, listening to their daughter sing a song that shouldn't exist. The lyrics spoke of waiting by the road, of watching cars pass by while the sun set and rose and set again, of Mama promising to come back soon, of being a good girl, of not moving from this spot because Mama said to wait right here. Marcus threw off the covers and moved down the hallway, Lizzie close behind. Each step felt like walking through water, his body resisting what his mind knew he had to do. Emma's door was slightly ajar, and the cold that poured through the gap made their breath visible. He pushed the door open. Emma lay in bed, her eyes closed, her small body perfectly still beneath the covers. But her lips moved, forming words in that voice that was hers and wasn't, singing a lullaby that hadn't been heard in over 6 decades. The moonlight streaming through the window cast her face in silver, making her look like a porcelain doll, beautiful and lifeless and wrong. The bear sat upright on her pillow, its button eyes catching the light and gleaming with something that looked almost like satisfaction. The lullaby didn't just fill the room, it suffocated every other sound, every thought, every hope. Marcus called his daughter's name softly, then louder when she didn't respond. He crossed to the bed and gently shook her shoulder. Emma's eyes snapped open, but for a heartbeat, just one terrible heartbeat, they were empty, blank, looking at him without recognition, without any trace of the little girl he knew. Then she blinked, and Emma returned. She asked her daddy what was wrong, her voice small and confused and completely her own. She said she was sleeping. She said she was having the nicest dream. Lizzie asked what she was dreaming about, her voice shaking. Emma smiled, and the innocence of it made the situation even more horrifying. She said she was dreaming about her friend, about Lily. She said Lily was teaching her songs, old songs, pretty songs about waiting for people you love. Marcus and Lizzie exchanged looks over their daughter's head. Neither of them slept the rest of that night. They sat in Emma's room, watching her sleep, watching the bear that never seemed to change position but somehow always looked like it was staring at them. The next morning, everything got worse. Emma came down to breakfast, withdrawn, almost hollow. The vibrant little girl who usually chattered about school and friends and her latest drawings moved like a ghost through the kitchen. She sat at the table and stared at her cereal without touching it, her hands folded in her lap, the bear clutched against her chest. Lizzie told her gently to eat her breakfast. Emma shook her head and said that Lily needed to eat first, that it wasn't polite to eat before your guest. She said it with a formality that didn't belong to a 7-year-old, each word carefully enunciated like she was reciting rules from an etiquette book written decades ago. Marcus watched as his daughter carefully positioned the bear in the chair beside her, adjusting its arms so they rested on the table. She pantomimed, feeding it cereal, making small humming sounds of approval. Only after this ritual was complete did Emma pick up her own spoon. The singing was disturbing. What came next was absolutely devastating. Lizzie tried to take the bear away, suggesting gently that maybe Lily needed a nap while Emma went to school. Emma's reaction was immediate and violent. She screamed, not with a child's tantrum, but with genuine terror, as if Lizzie had threatened to cut off her arm. She clutched the bear so tightly that her fingernails dug into the worn fabric, and she begged them not to separate her from Lily. She said that Lily had been alone for so long, that everyone left Lily, that she couldn't bear to be alone again. The words came from Emma's mouth, but they carried a grief that was ancient and deep. Marcus and Lizzie backed off, horrified. They let Emma take the bear to school, despite every instinct, screaming that they should burn the thing immediately. That afternoon, Emma's teacher called. She said that Emma had been drawing during art class. She said the drawings were concerning. She said perhaps Marcus and Lizzie should come in for a conference because the images their daughter had created were soaked in darkness and violence that the teacher had never seen from such a young child. When Emma came home, Marcus asked to see her drawings. She handed them over without hesitation, her expression blank. The images made his stomach turn. A car twisted like paper, wrapped around a tree. A woman bent in grief beside a small grave. A teddy bear sitting by a roadside, waiting. And in every picture, drawn in Emma's careful 7-year-old hand, the same words repeated over and over in the margins. Mama's coming back. Mama promised. Mama's coming back. That night, the bear moved. Marcus had positioned it on Emma's dresser before tucking her in, placing it deliberately facing the wall. But when he checked on her an hour later, the bear sat on her nightstand, facing the bed. When he moved it back to the dresser, it appeared on the windowsill within minutes. The bear wasn't just moving, it was watching. On the third night, Emma spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, a thick 1,960 seconds, southern accent that dripped with loneliness from another era. She sat up in bed, eyes open but unseeing, and asked when her mama was coming back. She said Mama had promised. She said she'd been such a good girl, waiting by the road just like Mama said. She asked why Mama never came back, why nobody ever came back. Lizzie broke down completely. She grabbed Marcus's arm and demanded that he fix this, that he take that bear back to wherever he'd found it, that he make their daughter normal again. Her voice cracked with desperation and fear and the horrible understanding that something was stealing their little girl piece by piece. But Marcus already knew it was too late for that. What Emma couldn't tell them was that she wasn't alone in her head anymore, that every time she closed her eyes, she saw memories that weren't hers. A little girl in a yellow dress, a car ride, Mama saying she'd be right back, the sun setting, the cold coming, the waiting, the endless, eternal waiting. Each night, Emma slipped further away. How many nights did they have left? Marcus knew he had to find out the truth about that bear, but the truth was far more devastating than he could have imagined. Marcus drove back to the roadside memorial at dawn, when the Mississippi sun was just beginning to burn through the morning mist. In daylight, the location looked different, less ominous. Just another forgotten stretch of rural highway, where weeds grew tall and the asphalt cracked from decades of neglect. He pulled onto the shoulder exactly where he'd stopped 3 nights ago, his truck tires crunching over the same gravel, and stepped out into air that smelled of damp earth and cotton fields. The memorial was worse than he remembered. The white cross leaned at a severe angle, its paint peeling away in long strips that revealed rotted wood beneath. The name had been weathered into near illegibility, but Marcus could make out fragments if he squinted. M-A-R-G. And below that, beloved daughter. The flowers that had once decorated the site had long since decomposed into black mulch, and the weeds had grown so thick they nearly swallowed the cross entirely. But the space where the bear had sat was different. The fence post showed a clear outline, a bear-shaped absence in the dust and grime, as if something had been positioned there for so long it had left an imprint. Marcus traced the outline with his finger and felt his stomach turn. How many years had that bear sat here? How many seasons had it weathered, waiting for someone like him to come along and take it home? He photographed the memorial from every angle, noting the mile marker and the faded road sign nearby. Then he got back in his truck and drove to Jackson, his mind racing with questions that all led to the same terrible conclusion. He'd brought something into his home that should have stayed buried with the past. The Jackson Public Library sat in the heart of downtown, a brick building that had stood since the 1952. Marcus arrived when the doors opened at 9, startling the elderly librarian who clearly wasn't used to such urgent morning visitors. He asked about newspaper archives, specifically accidents that had occurred on Highway 49 between 1960 and 1970. The librarian led him to a room in the basement where microfiche machines gathered dust like relics from another age. She showed him how to load the film, how to scroll through the images, and then left him alone with decades of tragedy preserved on celluloid. Marcus started with 1965 and worked backward. His eyes burned from staring at the illuminated screen, scanning headline after headline of local news that meant nothing to him. Bake sales, high school football scores, political rallies, the mundane march of small-town life, punctuated occasionally by tragedy, a house fire here, a farming accident there. Then Marcus read the date on the newspaper and realized the horror was older than he was. The 14th of August, 1962. The headline stretched across the top of the page in bold type, "Local child killed in highway accident." Below it, a photograph that made Marcus's hands shake so violently he had to grip the edge of the table. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark curls and a bright smile. She wore a yellow dress with white flowers, and clutched in her arms, pressed against her chest like a treasure, was a teddy bear. The same teddy bear, identical button eyes, the same torn ear, the same worn brown fur that Marcus had picked up from that roadside 3 nights ago. The newspaper article didn't just tell a story, it ripped open a wound that had never healed. Margaret Pritchard. Everyone called her Maggie. 8 years old. Daughter of Dorothy and James Pritchard of rural Madison County. On the afternoon of the 13th of August, 1962, Dorothy's car had broken down on Highway 49. She'd told Maggie to wait by the roadside with her teddy bear while she walked to the nearest farmhouse to call for help. She'd promised to be right back. She'd made Maggie promise not to move from that spot. Dorothy had been gone less than 20 minutes. When she returned, a crowd had gathered. A drunk driver had swerved off the road, overcorrected, and lost control. The car had struck Maggie where she stood, killing her instantly. The teddy bear had been thrown 30 feet from the impact site, landing in the cotton field beyond the fence. Marcus read the article 3 times. each word carving itself into his memory. The driver had been a traveling salesman named Robert Keene, who'd been drinking since noon. He'd survived with minor injuries. He'd been sentenced to 5 years but served only 2. Then came the most devastating news of all. Marcus scrolled forward, searching for follow-up articles. He found them scattered across the years like breadcrumbs, leading deeper into tragedy. Dorothy Pritchard had erected the memorial at the exact spot where her daughter died. Every year on Maggie's birthday, Dorothy would place fresh flowers and Maggie's teddy bear at the site. She would sit there for hours, talking to a daughter who could never answer. James Pritchard left her in 1967. The article about their divorce was brief, clinical. It mentioned that Dorothy had been unable to move past her grief, that the house had become a shrine, that James couldn't live with a ghost anymore. Dorothy Pritchard's grief wasn't just deep, it was bottomless, an ocean of loss that had drowned everything it touched. Marcus found articles about Dorothy's arrest in 1973 for disturbing the peace. She'd attacked a man in a parking lot because he was driving the same model car that had killed Maggie. Another article from 1981 detailed her hospitalization after a breakdown at the memorial site. She'd been found there at midnight in the middle of winter, hypothermic, talking to her dead daughter. Marcus read about Dorothy visiting that roadside every single day for 36 years, and he wept not for the ghost, but for the love that had become a prison. The final article was an obituary from June 1998. Dorothy Pritchard, age 73, had died of heart failure. She had no surviving family. Her last request had been to be buried next to her daughter. The article mentioned that locals had seen her at the memorial site the day before she died, placing Maggie's teddy bear at the roadside one final time. Marcus did the math with trembling hands. Dorothy had died in 1998. It was now 2025. The bear had been sitting at that memorial for 27 years, waiting, weathering every season, absorbing every ounce of Dorothy's grief and Maggie's loneliness until it became something else entirely, not just a toy, a vessel, a trap. Marcus's blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over him. The bear wasn't haunted by accident. It had been deliberately placed there by a mother whose grief had never died, whose love had curdled into something desperate and hungry. Dorothy had left the bear as bait, hoping, praying that someone would take it home, that Maggie would finally have a chance to live again through another little girl. And Marcus had given her exactly what she wanted. He printed every article, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate the machine. The librarian asked if he was all right, and Marcus lied, saying he was fine, just doing research for a project. His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Marcus believed he had time to fix this. He was devastatingly wrong. He ran to his truck, the articles clutched in his fist, and drove home 20 miles over the speed limit. His phone rang twice, Lizzie calling, but he couldn't answer, couldn't explain, could barely think past the terror that had wrapped around his chest like barbed wire. The spirit of a dead child had attached itself to Emma, a little girl who'd been waiting by the roadside for 63 years, whose loneliness had become so profound it had soaked into the fabric of that bear like poison. And Marcus had invited her into their home, had watched Emma embrace her, had done nothing while his daughter slipped away piece by piece. He pulled into the driveway at 10:47 a.m., tires squealing. The front door was unlocked. Lizzie's car was in the garage. Everything looked normal from the outside. Their modest 2-story house with its neat lawn and white shutters, the basketball hoop over the garage, Emma's bike lying on its side in the driveway. But Marcus knew better. He burst through the front door, calling for Lizzie, calling for Emma. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that pressed against his eardrums like water pressure. He ran upstairs, taking the steps, 3 at a time, and threw open Emma's bedroom door. The room was empty, the bed was made, and on the pillow, positioned perfectly upright, with its button eyes staring directly at the door, sat the bear. But by the time Marcus got home, Emma was no longer just Emma. Marcus burst through the front door at 10:47 a.m. and knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. The house was dark, despite the morning sun blazing outside. Every curtain had been drawn, every blind closed, as if the building itself had decided to shut out the light. The temperature inside was at least 20 degrees colder than it should have been, and Marcus could see his breath forming clouds in the air as he stood in the entryway, his heart hammering against his ribs. Lizzie sat on the bottom stair, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She looked up when Marcus entered, and the terror in her eyes made his stomach drop. She tried to speak, to warn him, but only managed to point toward the living room before breaking down completely. Marcus moved slowly, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get out of this house and never come back. But Emma was in there. His daughter was in there. So he forced his feet to move, one step after another, until he reached the living room doorway. Emma sat in the center of the room in complete darkness, holding the bear, rocking back and forth with a mechanical precision that was utterly wrong. She hummed that lullaby, the one about waiting by the road, about Mama coming back soon, and her voice carried that same ancient sadness that had filled the house for the past 3 nights. Marcus called his daughter's name softly, the way you might approach a wounded animal. Emma's head turned slowly, too slowly, her neck rotating with an unnatural smoothness. When she looked at him, Marcus felt something inside his chest crack and splinter. Emma's eyes weren't just vacant, they were hollowed out, replaced by something ancient and desperate. Lizzie didn't know it yet, but she had already lost her daughter the moment Marcus walked through that door. Marcus asked Emma if she was okay, if she knew who he was. His voice shook despite his efforts to sound calm. Emma smiled, and it was the most horrifying thing Marcus had ever seen. It was Emma's face, Emma's features, but the expression belonged to someone else entirely. She spoke, and her voice carried that thick 1,960 seconds Southern accent that dripped with loneliness from another era. She said she was fine, just fine, and asked if her mama was coming back yet. She said she'd been such a good girl. She said she'd waited right here, just like Mama told her to. The cold didn't just creep into the room, it slammed into them like a physical force. Marcus moved closer, kneeling in front of his daughter, trying to see past the possession to the little girl underneath. He told her gently that he was her daddy, that her name was Emma, that they needed to put the bear down, now. Emma's face contorted, confusion and fear battling with something else, something that had been waiting 63 years for a body to inhabit. She asked why he kept calling her that name. She said her name was Maggie. Margaret Ann Pritchard. She said she lived on Willow Creek Road, with her mama and daddy, and their dog Rusty. She said she was 8 years old and she'd been waiting by the road and she was so cold, and why wouldn't Mama come back? This wasn't just a haunting. This was a possession driven by 63 years of desperate, unfinished love. Lizzie finally found her voice and begged Marcus to do something. To fix this. To bring their daughter back. She crawled across the floor toward Emma, reaching out with trembling hands. Emma recoiled violently, clutching the bear tighter against her chest. She screamed at them not to take Lily away, that everyone takes Lily away, that Lily was all she had left, that she'd been alone for so long and she couldn't be alone anymore. The words poured out in a torrent of grief so profound it made the air itself feel heavy. Marcus tried a different approach. Emma asked Maggie what she remembered about that day, about the day she'd been waiting. Emma's face went slack, her eyes glazing over as memories that weren't hers flooded through her 7-year-old mind. She described the yellow dress with white flowers that she'd been wearing, the way the sun had been hot on her face, how Mama's car had made funny noises before it stopped working, how Mama had told her to wait right here, right by this fence post, and not to move no matter what. How she'd been good, how she'd waited, how the sun had set, and it got cold, and Mama still hadn't come back. Then she described the car, the drunk driver, the moment of impact, the pain, the confusion, the realization that she was dead, but still waiting, still stuck in that moment, unable to leave because Mama had told her to stay right there. The worst part wasn't the possession, it was the brief moments when Emma came back, terrified, begging them to make it stop, before Maggie pulled her under again. It happened suddenly, like a drowning person breaking the surface for one desperate breath. Emma's eyes cleared, and she looked at her parents with recognition and absolute terror. She called out for them, her voice high and panicked, saying there was someone else inside her head, someone sad and angry and so lonely it hurt. She said she couldn't make her leave. She said she was scared. She said she didn't want to disappear. Then Maggie surged back, and Emma's face went blank again, and the moment was gone. Lizzie collapsed, sobbing, and Marcus felt his own tears streaming down his face. They were losing her. Every hour that passed, Emma spoke less, and Maggie spoke more. The possession was progressive, invasive, like a tide slowly drowning their daughter from the inside out. Marcus asked desperately what Maggie wanted. What would make her leave? Emma stood up with eerie precision, still clutching the bear, and walked toward the front door. She said she wanted to go home, that she'd been away from home for too long, that Mama must be so worried. She reached for the doorknob with a compulsion that came from somewhere beyond her control. Marcus grabbed her, pulling her back, and Emma fought him with a strength that shouldn't exist in a 7-year-old's body. She screamed that she needed to go home, that Mama was waiting, that she'd promised to come right back. Lizzie lunged forward and tried to pry the bear from Emma's grip. Emma's scream was high-pitched, agonized, the sound of a child abandoned for 63 years finally finding connection and having it ripped away. The temperature plummeted so fast that frost formed on the windows. The lights flickered. Every picture on the walls crashed to the floor simultaneously. Emma's voice, when she spoke again, came from somewhere deep and primal and absolutely devastating. She begged them not to leave her again. She said everyone leaves her, everyone always leaves, that she'd been waiting so long and she was so cold and so alone, and please, please don't make her go back to that roadside. Don't make her wait anymore. Marcus and Lizzie froze, Emma's words cutting through them like broken glass. They realized with growing horror that they couldn't separate Emma from the bear without destroying her. The possession had gone too deep. Maggie had woven herself into Emma's consciousness so thoroughly that tearing them apart might shatter both of them. They had maybe 48 hours before Emma wouldn't be Emma anymore. That night, they took shifts, watching their daughter. Emma sat in bed, the bear in her lap, staring at nothing. Sometimes she spoke in her own voice, asking for water or saying she was tired, but more often, she spoke in Maggie's voice, asking about RC Cola and moon pies, and when the Ed Sullivan Show would be on television. She talked about friends from 1962 like they were still alive. She hummed songs that hadn't been popular in 60 years. The look in Emma's eyes, half her daughter, half a ghost from 1962, would haunt Marcus until his dying day. By dawn, Emma had stopped responding to her own name entirely. Marcus had brought something into his home that wouldn't leave, and now he had to face the most terrifying question of all. Was his daughter still in there? Marcus found Evelyn Chambers through a frantic internet search at 2 a.m. while Lizzie sat vigil over Emma's sleeping form. The local Historical Society website listed her as a founding member and primary archivist for Madison County records, dating back to the 1800s. At 78 years old, Evelyn had spent her entire life documenting the stories that everyone else wanted to forget. Marcus called her number at 2:47 a.m., expecting voicemail, but she answered on the second ring as if she'd been waiting for his call. She told him to come at dawn and gave him an address on the outskirts of Jackson. Evelyn's house was a small Victorian that looked like it had been frozen in 1975. The porch sagged under the weight of potted plants that had long since died, and the paint peeled in strips that revealed layers of color beneath yellow, then blue, then white, like archaeological strata of neglect. But inside, the house was immaculate. Every surface covered with books, newspapers, photographs, and documents organized with obsessive precision. Evelyn met him at the door, a tiny woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much tragedy to be shocked by anything anymore. She looked at Marcus's face and nodded, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. She told him quietly that he'd found the bear. Marcus asked how she knew, his voice breaking. Evelyn said she'd been waiting for this call for 27 years. Ever since Dorothy Pritchard died and left that bear at the roadside, she'd known someone would eventually take it home. She'd prayed they wouldn't, but prayer had never stopped tragedy before. She led Marcus into what had once been a dining room but now served as an archive. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled with family names and dates. Evelyn pulled one marked Pritchard 1955 to 1998 and set it on the table between them. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten letters that told a story more devastating than any article Marcus had read. Evelyn explained that she'd known Dorothy Pritchard personally. They'd attended the same church. She'd watched Dorothy transform from a vibrant young mother into a hollowed-out shell consumed by grief that had no bottom. The accident hadn't just killed Maggie, it had murdered Dorothy's soul piece by piece over 36 years. Then came the moment that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Evelyn pulled out a photograph dated the 12th of August, 1962, one day before Maggie died. It showed Dorothy and Maggie at a church picnic, both smiling, Maggie clutching her teddy bear. On the back, in Dorothy's handwriting, were words that made Marcus's chest constrict. "My beautiful girl, my whole world, I will never let anything hurt you." But something had hurt her, and Dorothy blamed herself with a ferocity that destroyed her from the inside out. Evelyn described how Dorothy had replayed that day endlessly, how she'd tortured herself with what-ifs that had no answers. What if she'd taken Maggie with her to the farmhouse? What if she'd waited with the car? What if she'd never told Maggie to stand by the roadside? The guilt became a living thing that consumed everything else, her marriage, her friendships, her sanity. Dorothy visited that memorial every single day for 36 years, rain or shine, holidays and weekends. She would sit by the cross and talk to Maggie as if her daughter could hear her. She would apologize over and over, begging for forgiveness that could never come. Evelyn said these weren't just visits. They were rituals of grief that never healed, only deepened. Dorothy poured her love and guilt and desperate longing into that roadside until the ground itself felt cursed, and the bear absorbed it all. It wasn't just one spirit. It was the combined weight of a child's loneliness and a mother's guilt, twisted together into something that couldn't rest. When Dorothy died in 1998, Maggie was truly abandoned, trapped in the bear, waiting at the roadside, desperate for someone to take her home. For 63 years, Maggie had waited for her mother to come back, and when Dorothy finally did return, year after year, it only reinforced the waiting, the hoping, the belief that if she was just patient enough, good enough, still enough, Mama would take her home. Marcus wasn't just fighting a ghost. He was fighting the most powerful force in existence, a mother's love that refused to die. Evelyn pulled out Dorothy's journal from the final year of her life. The entries were barely legible, written in a shaking hand that deteriorated with each page. Dorothy wrote about feeling Maggie's presence at the memorial, about hearing her daughter's voice asking when they could go home, about the unbearable knowledge that she'd failed her child in the worst possible way. The final entry, dated 2 days before Dorothy's death, said simply, "I'm coming, baby girl. Mama's finally coming to take you home." But death hadn't reunited them. It had only made Maggie's abandonment complete. Marcus told Evelyn about Emma, about how his daughter was disappearing piece by piece, replaced by a desperate ghost who kept asking for her mama, about how they couldn't separate Emma from the bear without destroying her. The haunting was terrifying. The realization that Emma wanted to stay with Lily was absolutely soul-destroying. Evelyn confirmed what Marcus had been afraid to acknowledge. Emma wasn't just possessed, she was being erased. Maggie wasn't trying to hurt her. She was trying to become her, to finally have the life that had been stolen in 1962. And Emma, lonely and neglected by a father who worked too much, and a mother exhausted from holding everything together, had welcomed the companionship. The parallel shattered Marcus completely. He'd been abandoning Emma, just like Dorothy had abandoned Maggie. Not through death, but through absence, through choosing work over family, through missing science projects and bedtime stories, and all the small moments that built a childhood. And in that moment, Marcus understood the most horrifying truth of all. He had become the very thing that created this tragedy, an absent parent. Evelyn leaned forward, her ancient eyes boring into Marcus with an intensity that made him flinch. She told him there was only one way to break this, only one thing that could free Maggie and save Emma. He had to reunite Maggie with Dorothy, even in death. The bear had to be returned to Dorothy's grave. Maggie had to understand that. Her mother never abandoned her, that Dorothy had loved her so fiercely it had destroyed her, that the waiting was over, that it was finally time to go home. But the ritual wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't be safe. Maggie had been waiting for 63 years. She wouldn't let go easily. And that's when Marcus understood what he had to do, something that would either save his daughter or lose her forever. Marcus returned home at 6:32 a.m. to find Lizzie sitting at the kitchen table, her face hollow with exhaustion and terror. Emma was upstairs, still clutching the bear, still humming that godforsaken lullaby that had become the soundtrack to their nightmare. Lizzie looked up when Marcus entered, and the hope in her eyes was so desperate it physically hurt him to see it. She asked if he'd found anything, if there was any way to fix this, if their daughter was going to be okay. Marcus sat down across from her and told her everything. He explained about Margaret Pritchard, about the accident in 1962, about Dorothy's 36 years of grief that had soaked into that bear like poison. He told her about Evelyn Chambers and the journal entries and the devastating truth that Maggie wasn't trying to hurt Emma, she was trying to replace her, to finally live the life that had been stolen 63 years ago. Lizzie listened without interrupting, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. When Marcus finished, she asked him what they were supposed to do, how they were supposed to fight a ghost powered by 6 decades of loneliness and a mother's guilt. Marcus took a shaky breath and laid out the plan that Evelyn had given him. They had to take the bear to Dorothy Pritchard's grave at Pinewood Cemetery. They had to help Maggie understand that her mother never abandoned her, that Dorothy had loved her until her dying breath, that the waiting was finally over. If they could reunite Maggie with Dorothy, even in death, the spirit would release Emma and find peace. Lizzie stared at him like he'd lost his mind. She asked how he could possibly know this would work. What if it made things worse? What if taking the bear to the cemetery only strengthened the possession? Marcus admitted he didn't know. That this was insane, desperate, that he was gambling with their daughter's life, and he knew it. Lizzie collapsed, not from fear, but from the soul-crushing realization that her baby was being erased. She told Marcus through tears that Emma had forgotten her own birthday that morning, had looked at Lizzie with confused eyes and asked who she was before Maggie's presence receded, and Emma came back, apologizing, crying, terrified of what was happening to her. Every hour that passed, more of Emma disappeared. Her memories, her personality, her voice. One wrong move, and Emma would be lost forever, not dead, but gone, replaced by a ghost who'd been waiting 63 years for a body. This wasn't just about getting rid of a haunted toy, this was about whether Emma would survive with her soul intact. Marcus reached across the table and took Lizzie's hands. He told her they had no choice, that if they did nothing, Emma would be completely gone within 48 hours, that this was their only chance. Lizzie nodded, wiping her eyes, and asked when they would leave. Marcus said they'd go tonight, that they needed to do this under cover of darkness when the cemetery was closed, that Evelyn had given him the location of Dorothy's grave and warned him that the ritual wouldn't be simple, that Maggie had been holding on for so long, she wouldn't let go easily. They spent the day preparing, moving through the house like ghosts themselves. Lizzie packed a bag with flashlights, blankets, and the printed articles about Maggie's death. Marcus wrote down everything Evelyn had told him, trying to prepare for something that couldn't be prepared for. Emma stayed in her room, sitting cross-legged on her bed with the bear in her lap. When Marcus checked on her at noon, she looked up at him with eyes that were only partially his daughter's. She spoke in a voice that wavered between Emma's 7-year-old pitch and something older, sadder. She told her daddy that Lily was scared, that Lily didn't remember what her mama looked like anymore, that she'd been waiting so long, everything had gotten fuzzy and dark and cold. The idea broke Marcus completely. He knelt beside Emma's bed and took her small hands in his. He promised her that they were going to help Lily find her mama, that the waiting was almost over, that everything would be okay. Emma looked at him with an expression far too ancient for her face and asked softly if he was sure, if he promised. Because everyone always promised, but nobody ever came back. Marcus's hands trembled violently as he pulled his daughter into his arms. He could feel the bear pressed between them, cold and wrong, and he could feel Emma slipping away even as he held her. At 3 in the afternoon, Emma had a moment of clarity that lasted less than 5 minutes. She grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength and whispered that she couldn't remember what she looked like anymore, that when she closed her eyes, she saw a different face, a girl in a yellow dress, that she was scared, so scared, because Lily was getting stronger and Emma was getting smaller. When Emma whispered that she couldn't remember what she looked like anymore, Marcus felt his heart shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He held her and promised that tonight they would fix this, that he wouldn't let Lily take her away, that he would fight for her with everything he had. Then Maggie surged forward again, and Emma's eyes went vacant. She pulled away from Marcus and returned to the bear, humming that lullaby, rocking back and forth with mechanical precision. Lizzie came to the doorway and told Marcus it was time, that they couldn't wait any longer. They packed the car in silence. The bear went into a canvas bag that Lizzie couldn't bring herself to touch. Emma walked downstairs on her own, moving with an eerie grace that didn't belong to a 7-year-old. She climbed into the back seat without being asked and buckled her seatbelt. The bear clutched against her chest. Marcus looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror and saw both Emma and Maggie looking back at him. Two little girls occupying the same space, one desperate to stay, one desperate to finally go home. At 4 a.m, the Webb family drove into the darkness toward a grave that held the only person who could end this nightmare. The roadside memorial looked different at 4:47 a.m., caught in that liminal space between night and dawn when the world holds its breath. Marcus pulled onto the shoulder at the exact spot where he'd found the bear 5 days ago, 5 days that felt like a lifetime. Lizzie sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hand gripping the door handle so tightly her fingers had gone numb. In the back seat, Emma hummed that lullaby, her eyes fixed on something none of them could see. They got out of the car into air that felt wrong, too still, too heavy, the kind of silence that pressed against eardrums and made breathing difficult. Marcus lifted the canvas bag containing the bear, and the moment his fingers touched it, cold shot up his arms like electricity. Lizzie took Emma's hand. Emma didn't resist, but she didn't acknowledge her mother either. She simply walked toward the memorial with mechanical precision, as if being pulled by invisible strings. The white cross leaned at its familiar angle, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus set the bear at the base of the memorial, in the exact spot where it had sat for 27 years, the spot where its outline remained burned into the wood. Then the three of them joined hands, Marcus, Lizzie, and Emma, forming a circle around the memorial, around the bear. Around 63 years of unfinished tragedy. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted so fast their breath became visible clouds. Wind picked up from nowhere, whipping through the cotton fields despite the still night. The air became electric with supernatural energy that made their hair stand on end and their skin crawl. Marcus felt it building, a pressure that threatened to crush them all. Emma stopped humming, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and when she spoke, her voice was layered, her voice and Maggie's speaking in unison, creating a sound that shouldn't exist. She asked where Mama was, why Mama wasn't here. Everyone had promised Mama would come, but Mama never came. They all felt her presence, confused, afraid, angry at being forgotten. Lizzie's grip on Emma's hand tightened, tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, but couldn't form words past the terror that had locked her throat. Marcus forced himself to kneel, bringing his face level with Emma's. He looked into his daughter's eyes and saw both girls staring back, Emma terrified and fading, Maggie desperate and ancient. He spoke directly to the spirit that had stolen his daughter, his voice shaking but determined. He told Maggie that her mama never forgot her, that Dorothy had come to this spot every single day for 36 years, that she'd loved Maggie so much it had destroyed her, consumed her entire life, turned her into a ghost long before she died. The silence after Emma stopped singing wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, thick with dread. Marcus continued, desperation pouring from his soul. He explained that Dorothy wasn't here at the roadside, that she was waiting somewhere else, at Greenwood Cemetery, where she'd been buried in 1998 with Maggie's name carved next to hers on the headstone, that Dorothy had been waiting for 27 years for Maggie to come home. Emma's body went rigid. The presence around them intensified. Decades of loneliness made manifest. Maggie's confusion rolled over them in waves. She'd been waiting here, right here where Mama had left her, where Mama had promised to come back. Lizzie found her voice and added that Dorothy had tried to come back, that she'd visited this spot thousands of times. But death had taken her before she could bring Maggie home. Now they needed to finish what Dorothy couldn't. They needed to take Maggie to where her mother rested. By sunrise, they needed an answer or they'd lose their daughter forever. Time was running out, and Marcus could feel it slipping through his fingers like sand. The wind died suddenly. The electric charge in the air shifted from hostile to uncertain. Emma's eyes flickered. Maggie, warring with Emma, both girls fighting for control. Then Emma's mouth opened, and a single word emerged in a voice that was purely Maggie's, small and broken and desperate. "Mama?" Marcus nodded, his own tears falling freely now. He promised that yes, they would take her to Mama, that the waiting was finally over. Emma's body relaxed. She picked up the bear with trembling hands and held it against her chest. When she looked at Marcus again, Maggie's presence had softened from hostile to hopeful. They got back in the car as the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. Emma sat in the back seat, clutching the bear, whispering to it in words too quiet to hear. Lizzie navigated while Marcus drove, following the route to Greenwood Cemetery that Evelyn had marked on a hand-drawn map. And, as the first light of dawn broke over Greenwood Cemetery, they were about to discover if love really could transcend death. Greenwood Cemetery sat on the eastern edge of Jackson, a sprawling expanse of weathered headstones and ancient oaks that cast long shadows in the early morning light. Marcus drove through the iron gates at 5:43 a.m., following the winding path that Evelyn had marked on her map. The cemetery wasn't just quiet, it was silent in a way that felt wrong, as if even the birds refused to sing there. Lizzie sat with the map trembling in her hands, calling out section numbers and row markers while Emma remained motionless in the back seat, the bear pressed against her chest. They found Dorothy Pritchard's grave in Section D, Row 12, Plot 7. The headstone was simple gray granite, neglected and forgotten, covered in decades of grime and moss. The inscription was barely visible. Dorothy Ann Pritchard, 1935 to 1998, beloved mother of Margaret Louise. No flowers had been placed there in years. Marcus lifted the bear from Emma's arms. Emma's skin wasn't just cold, it was corpse cold, the temperature of a child who'd been lying by a roadside for 63 winters. They were about to do something that could either save Emma or damn her to the same fate as Maggie Pritchard. Marcus's hands didn't just shake, they trembled violently, as if his body was rejecting what his mind was being forced to accept. He knelt and placed the bear directly on Dorothy's grave, positioning it against the headstone, where mother and daughter's names were carved together in stone. Nothing happened at first, and Lizzie's heart stopped. The waiting was agonizing. Lizzie feared they'd failed, that Emma was lost. Then Emma moved. She walked forward as if compelled by invisible strings and knelt beside the bear. Her small hand touched the worn fur, and she began singing the lullaby one final time. But something was different. The melody transformed, shifting from desperate and haunting to something beautiful, complete. The air warmed dramatically. Sunlight broke through the cemetery trees like a blessing, illuminating Dorothy's grave. The oppressive weight lifted all at once. Emma gasped a deep, shuddering breath and her eyes cleared. She told them in her own 7-year-old voice that Lily had found her mama, that they were together now, and Lily wasn't scared anymore. Marcus grabbed Emma and pulled her into his arms, weeping openly. The bear lay on Dorothy's grave, just a toy now, its desperate energy completely gone. They all felt it, a peace so complete, it was like a held breath, finally released after 63 years. Maggie Pritchard had gone home. Marcus placed fresh flowers and promised aloud that he would visit regularly, that neither Dorothy nor Maggie would be forgotten again. And Marcus Webb learned what the title promised. Some toys are abandoned for a reason, because they carry the weight of love so powerful that not even death can break it, and grief so deep it can trap a soul for decades. Never pick up abandoned toys by the roadside, because you never know who's been waiting there, or what they'll do to find their way home.